Here in the studios of KUCR, we're going to be talking to Dr. Jade Sasser about her latest book, Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, Deciding Whether to Have Children in an Uncertain Future. Dr. Jade is an associate professor at the University of California, Riverside. She's an author of On Infertile Ground, Population Control and Women's Rights in the Era of Climate Change. And she is the host of the podcast Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, which you can catch here on KUCR on Thursdays at 7:30 a.m. and Sundays at 7 p.m. Dr. Jade, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So first things first, for those who are not familiar with the concept, what is climate and anxiety?
So climate anxiety is a new term. It's been coined by researchers in the fields of environmental psychology and environmental humanities. It's an umbrella term, too, so it doesn't describe just one thing. But it talks about how increasingly, as we see more impacts of climate change, from heat waves to storms, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, etc., so much uncertainty, so many impacts, so many lives disrupted from those impacts, people are increasingly feeling really distressed about it. And so the term climate anxiety, it refers to all sorts of emotional responses, from anxiety to depression, grief, sadness, loss, worry, concern, even feelings of trauma, being traumatized by these impacts. But climate anxiety is kind of a shorthand way of getting us there. And increasingly, because that term is being used more and more often, more and more people know what it means.
How does your book explore sort of this concept of climate anxiety and how it relates to having a kid and that sort of kid question?
Yeah, so a lot of people experience climate anxiety, but we don't all experience it in the same way. More and more research, whether it's opinion, poll, survey kinds of research, or more qualitative stuff, more and more research is showing that young people experience climate anxiety the most. A study by the American Psychiatric Association found that close to 70% of Generation Z and millennials are worried about their own mental health in the context of climate change.
Wow.
And there have been a couple of other surveys that have found that Gen Z and young millennials are making life decisions in response to how they feel about climate change, including where they want to live in the future, what they want to do for a living, and yes, whether they will have children or not. What I found in the research for this book is that young people really are factoring in climate change and how they feel about the future, a future of climate impacts. They're factoring that into sort of what they see as moral and ethical questions. Is it morally okay to bring a child into this world that didn't ask to be here, when we know that climate change is bad right now and will continue to get worse? And we know, and young people who are the most climate literate generation, know that certain kinds of impacts are kind of baked in for at least the next couple or few decades. So we definitely can and should work to make significant changes now. But even if we make the kinds of changes that will lower emissions right now today, there are certain effects that we will continue to feel for decades. So that question of knowing that, is it okay to bring someone else into this situation? That's the question that's at the heart of this book. And there are a lot of responses to that question.
That's very interesting. Yeah, the sort of, should I bring someone into a situation that I know won't be as good as when I came into it? It was very insightful. What drew you towards these sort of topics and these ideas when you were researching and writing this book?
Well, I initially, this is a COVID book. And what I mean by that is I had a completely different research topic. I was going to write a very different book. But that other book would have required me to travel abroad. And I had a trip to Madagascar on the books. I was supposed to go there for a month in May 2020. And then all of a sudden in March or April, I had to cancel that trip and all of my travel and pivot. And I was like, well, pivot to what? And what I had been doing for at least about 6 months prior to that time was just collecting and storing articles about climate anxiety, climate emotions, climate and mental health outcomes, and the growing field of climate-aware psychology. And I turned to those articles and started saying, maybe there's a project here. I think that what was most interesting to me about those articles was that they really focused on a very narrow and non-diverse group of young people. And what happens when you don't focus on a broad array of people is that it gives the idea or the impression that everyone is having the same experience. And I just knew that to not be true. And I wondered, is it simply because more people of color are not included in the articles that were being written? So I started looking for any kind of mention of race in the surveys, in the opinion polls, and in the, newspaper and magazine articles. What I found was really interesting. So there were a couple of surveys that asked about race, and those that did consistently found that Black and Latinx youth were more likely to say that climate change was impacting their reproductive plans. Wow. And yet, the bigger academic studies that were delving into the issues more deeply did not have people of color represented in their samples, in the pool of people that they were studying. And I thought, this is a really strange exclusion. It doesn't fit what we know about who is most distressed and whose distress might be shaping their reproductive plans. And if no one else is doing their research and focusing on race, I guess I'm going to have to do it myself. So I did.
That's a good way to go about a lot of things. Yeah. And 2020, that would have been around the birth of climate anxiety as a term. That would have been close to the beginning of it, no?
I think that's when the term really got up and running. There were some scholars like Panu Pikala in Finland, Sarah Jaquette Ray. They were using the term. They were researching and writing articles about it. Maria Ohala in Sweden. But yeah, Sarah Jaquette Ray's book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, came out that year.
Wow.
And after that book came out, I feel like the term became ubiquitous. I started seeing it everywhere. And I also want to say the European research on this subject is way ahead of the United States. European scholars have been studying climate anxiety and similar emotions for longer. American research has taken longer to catch up, but right now we're kind of witnessing an explosion of these kinds of studies, books, articles, op-eds, you name it. And not just research, but groups that are mobilized to respond. So there are climate cafes that have been popping up, and these are groups of people at the community level simply coming together to talk through their climate emotions and mental health. Not necessarily to find solutions, but to bring the issue out of the shadows, to destigmatize it, and to create collective community. I'd say we're still sort of at the beginning of those efforts, but we're going to see a lot more of them.
Yeah, not necessarily. Although fixing climate change is something that we should be focused on, a lot of those efforts more towards easing ourselves about it and focusing on the anxiety side of things.
Yeah, and I do want to say, sometimes people ask me what's the solution to climate anxiety. And I want to be clear, climate anxiety is a normal response to the disruptions of climate change. To fix climate anxiety, we need to fix climate change. And so that's why the climate cafes don't look for solutions. They don't look for solutions to climate emotions. They look for collectivity, community, and creating a sense of joy in the midst of distress. And the reason why is because people who are coming to climate cafes generally are already active in one way or another on the climate struggle and are still distressed about it.
That makes a lot of sense. To sort of build off of this concept, what could me as a student, or maybe everyone in the wider world, what can we do on an everyday level to sort of help ease climate change and the sort of building climate anxiety surrounding it?
Well, I actually am curious. I'd like to turn that question around and ask you, have you or your friends ever expressed feeling kind of upset or distressed about climate change?
I've heard more like nothing super serious, but like it's something that's around. It's kind of like present. Maybe it has to deal with that sort of like stigma around it and how, if you have this anxiety, you have to kind of not share it. So beyond its existence, I would not have as much experience with it as maybe some others.
The reason I asked that question is because it is exactly that, the not sharing with others, not talking about it, that makes the feelings of distress worse. People who I've interviewed, both in the book and in my podcast, have shared over and over again that when you are able to talk to other people about how you're feeling and to realize that you are not alone, that you're not having an isolated experience, that nothing is wrong with you, that, kind of your self-imposed stigma and pressure really lessens. And having those conversations, I think, is also a way of finding a way forward that we can't find when we don't have the conversation. Because one of the things that I've learned from people who run climate cafes is that they have decided to do new and interesting things like focus on art as a way of getting into climate joy. And what I mean by that is musicians, filmmakers, people who do visual art. They're using those skills and talents to connect with other people who are climate aware and to talk about, their love of nature, the outdoors, eco-empathy, which is a way of thinking about how we empathize with the planet and its suffering and want to alleviate that suffering. And drawing people in through art can be a lot more effective than drawing them in through numbers and facts and figures and research books. Although I hope people will be drawn into this book.
Yeah, very much so. I personally believe that a lot of people will be. I definitely was drawn into this book doing this interview, of course. I believe I have one more question to ask you. It is, given what you found in your research while doing this book and in the other articles you found, what are some of the big points of like beaming lights of hope that you see for the future?
I'll be honest with you. I don't know if I see big beaming lights of hope. I see lots and lots of small beams that when they come together, they produce a larger beam. One thing that people say consistently over and over and over again in all of the podcast interviews is that none of us can do this alone. None of us can navigate distress of any kind by ourselves, at least not effectively. And increasingly, this question about how to have and raise children, not just biologically, but how to create family in ways that maybe are not the ways that you previously thought that you would do it. These things require coming together with other people, having conversations, sharing resources, and building networks and communities. And that goes far beyond the question of having kids, right? It's more like, if we're going to face evacuations from wildfires, we need to have strong relationships with our neighbors or someone around us so that we can have a better plan when that kind of thing goes on. And we know that there are more wildfires because of climate change and vegetation and dry vegetation and heat and all of those kinds of things. So what I'm finding and what I've heard and what I think I'll keep hearing from people is that the hope comes from A, acknowledging the problem, B, understanding this is not a personal problem or an individual failing, C, understanding that this is collective, D, organizing together with other people who care, and then also E, holding politicians and government leaders, decision makers, their feet to the fire, right? Because, climate impacts continue to advance when we've got government leaders who continue approving oil and gas drilling leases, for example. We need to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We need to invest in alternative energy. And I think for the everyday person who says, well, okay, but that's something a politician would do, one thing that we can do is to say, well, you know what? Every election is a climate election, from the presidential election down to the city council election. And those local decisions at the city council level are just as important as the presidential ones. So, yeah, I think that's the long answer to that question.
Very thorough. I enjoyed it very much. Very thought-provoking, very intuitive. I think that's all we have for today. I would like to say again, thank you very much for sitting and talking to me about the book.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, of course.